This episode of Faith in Focus is a little bit different. It's a pre-recording of me teaching from my local church this week. And I'm teaching through the book of Mark. And in Mark chapter 7, Jesus is ministering to Gentile people. So this issue of race, cross-race ministry and interracial relationships cropped up. And so I took the opportunity to just delve into how the Bible teaches we should view race and racism and deal with it from a gospel issue. And this is obviously at the forefront of what is going on in our culture today. And I took the time to discuss and address a popular discussion guide that just got released from a very prominent global Christian organization for its members and the people in the organization, and is very concerning to me. So we discuss how dealing with racism from a worldly perspective, this kind of anti-racist, left-leaning way of dealing with racism is not biblical. And so that's what we talk about in this episode. And like I said, it's a recording from my church, so if you hear some background noises, people interjecting, it's pretty casual. There's a lot of people interacting with the discussion. So, and I tried to edit some of that stuff out just because it's not relevant maybe to the broader audience. But that's what this recording is, and we discuss just the biblical view of race and how we should view race and racism from a biblical gospel perspective. I hope you enjoy it. Well, I guess we'll get back into Mark chapter 7, getting a little bit into 8, and then discuss. We talked a little bit about last week because it was just topical, and then it became even more topical this week. I just want to touch on this issue. It manifests itself as racism, but it's obviously just discrimination. I listened to one guy who just, he's a black guy, but he wears a shirt that just says racism doesn't exist. And it really bothers people. And obviously it's a overly simplistic, but he just always says, he said it's just sin. People are just wicked and people just, but of course racism and just, adultery exists. You can't just say, well, adultery doesn't exist. People are just sinful. Things still exist, but so last week we had gotten to 7 when Jesus made all foods clean. And then he goes out to the Syrophoenician woman. We looked at that. And now he's out in the region of Tyre and Sidon, the Decapolis. And he's out and amongst the Gentiles. And we're going to look at the healing of the deaf mute and then the feeding of the 4,000, possibly. But these are all happening in Gentile people. And we had tied in, and I had never thought this before. And obviously, this is just an indicator that you think you know everything, and then you realize, oh yeah, I don't know everything. But, and it's something that just seems so obvious that's like, oh yeah, Jesus makes all foods clean and then goes and heals and works amongst people who are unclean. And that's the exact lesson that Peter learns in chapter 10 of the book of Acts. God says, eat this unclean food. And he's like, no. And he's like, don't call unclean what I've called clean. I've made food clean. I've made, these people, don't call them unclean. So then Peter gets called to go into Cornelius' house. So that's, Peter writing this gospel through Mark. He's probably letting people know, listen, this is where Jesus modeled this for us. And Peter being Peter, a guy, a human, I don't know, whatever category you want to lump him into, obviously didn't get that message and really figure that out till much later in the book of Acts. Jesus had to remind him, but we had talked about this issue because there's nothing new under the sun, and the things that we're dealing with now in our culture that are at the not the bulwark, but the pinnacle, of what we're fighting about in our culture is just like, you look at it and you just think, I thought we dealt with that in our country 60, Mark, you talk about all the time, just that's the stuff you were dealing with in high school was racism, prejudice, and then just moving through that, the civil rights movement, and realizing, oh yeah, okay, the biblical model is you don't judge person based on their group or their race or their ethnicity or whatever. You view them as individuals. And if you want to view people as a group, pulling Romans 1 through 3, humanity is a group and we're all sinful. That's the group. So, and that's kind of the point, Jesus is saying, like, yes, there was clean and unclean that modeled a difference between Jew and Gentile. And that's that does illustrate the fact that just like in Christ, you can say, well, we're all equal. There's no male or female. But there's still male and female roles. So how does that work? I'm not necessarily sure. In Christ, there's neither Jew nor Greek, yet there's still Jew and Greek role within the world. Like, the nation of Israel has a certain role and the Gentiles have a certain role. But when you view people just as a group, that becomes problematic. The Syrophoenician woman, she's just a dog. She's a Gentile. We don't need to. And Jesus is like, no. You might view the group that way, which would be wrong, but this individual person is someone created in the image of God, and they need the gospel. They need the witness of Christ. So this is what Jesus is modeling. Yeah, it's and that's why I say, like, this stuff isn't new, and it wasn't new in the 60s. I mean, it's just the same stuff recycling back over and over and over again. So it's not new today, but it's like, well, that sin and the deception, like, maybe puts on different faces, or it's like Satan tries to deceive and destroy one way, and okay, he might get beaten back. He's going to come in from a slightly different angle, and that's, I didn't want to get super political, and I don't want to get political because I don't think this is a politics thing, but you kind of almost have to almost say, like, I don't mean this to be political, but, you could say the sky is blue, and someone would say, well, why are you being political? Like, it's like, I mean, sorry, that's like, I'm just...
Someone would say, why are you being racist?
Why are you being, it's just like, it's just everything, But this is what's in our culture right now, and it's such a... I don't think that we realize how badly it has permeated our culture. And that was what this past year has been about with I don't know if you followed, and again, it it just happened to happen in Virginia, but if you followed that race there, like, what it was essentially over was these parents, their kids were in school learning this stuff that any sane person would say, this is just racism. This is not okay. And then when the kids came home and they're learning from school, the parents heard what was being taught, and they're like, wait a second. You're not teaching my kids this stuff. And that was where the fight started to happen. So, it might be coming through the government, it might be coming through the school system, but it's just this battle. And I think it's why it's important to look at the gospel and what Scripture says and say, okay, well, wait a second. Why? And it's infiltrating the church, which we'll get to. This is why I wanted to address this week, because it just hit home to me personally. But it's like it's infiltrating the church because just this idea that, well, yes, the gospel would teach you. I mean, if you're a racist person, God would say, that's wrong. That's sin. So the church has adopted this mentality that, well, yes, tackling racism and dealing with racism is a gospel issue, which I don't think any of us would necessarily disagree with that. But the way in which they're doing it, they're adopting the way that the world battles this issue and is saying, we're going to use the world's tools to fight this battle and put it under the umbrella of it being a gospel issue. And it's sort of like, it's not quite as duplicitous, but it's sort of like the Black Lives Matter thing. Someone labels their organization Black Lives Matter, and they could be against a whole bunch of things that we as the church would be like, well, wait a second. We don't believe in abolishing the government. We don't believe in abolishing the police. Necessarily. Maybe there can be reform. We don't believe in abolishing the nuclear family, like mothers and fathers. But this is what this organization Express Purpose is at least part of. but the way they kind of do that fight is they say, well, what, you don't think Black Lives Matter? It's like, well, that's no, but I'm not going to fight this fight the same way that you fight it. So we have to understand that the answer, like what we're seeing with Jesus here in Mark chapter 7, is he's showing us to look at a person in whatever group. That's a woman, so whatever. That person's black, so this is what's true of them. Like, that's wrong. I mean, the person themselves might even, like, racism is essentially taking your stereotypes that you have and just applying them to people that you don't know anything about. Now, the sad thing is like when you see somebody who actually and then they live out the stereotype, what that unfortunately does for a lot of people is it reinforces the stereotype. Now, when we talked about the Syrophoenician woman last week, I made the point to say, Jesus went and said, this woman needs me. Like, she needs to encounter the Messiah. Had they gone there and she treated them like every Syrophoenician woman did, abused them, took advantage of them, hated them because the Gentiles hated the Jews just as much as the Jews hated the Gentiles, that wouldn't negate the fact that that person needs Christ. That individual still needs Christ. The Syrophoenician race, they need Christ, the individuals within it. So we just don't understand. I just don't think we understand how much, when we say that America is a Christian culture or a Christian country, we don't always mean that every single person in America should be going to church. What we do mean, though, is the people who founded this country believed in God, the biblical God. Now, they may have disagreed on to what extent he interacts with the world and Jesus, I don't know, but they looked at the Word of God and said, this is the morality that we are going to live our lives by and orchestrate our country. So, like, things like individual, like, you are an individual, so therefore you have rights. We take that for granted that that's just the way things are, and it's not the way things are. The way things are is what you see in the Bible as far as those are Syrophoenician people. We don't need to deal with those people. That's the way the world typically works. So,
It's like that in every other country.
and it's like that every other place. So that is why to circle back what's going on in our culture, and I want to just read some of the stuff that came up this week. I mean, it's not new. If you've had your ear to the ground, you hear this and you just think, well, wait a second. We can't be fighting this battle this way. It's just taking racism and trying to fight racism with race. It just does not make any sense. But let's read in verse 31, chapter 7. It says, Jesus went out again from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. See, these are Gentile cities, 10 cities on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. They brought to him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking. And his Kindle turned off, so he couldn't read. Okay, there it is. And after Jesus took him aside, and they asked him to place his hands on him. After Jesus took him aside privately, away from the crowd, he put his fingers in the man's ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven and said with a sigh, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. It's Aramaic for be opened. And immediately the man's ears were opened, his tongue loosened, and he spoke plainly. Jesus ordered him not to tell anything, but as much as he ordered them not to do this, they proclaimed it all the more. People were completely astounded and said, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. So this is another one of those messianic signs, the deaf being able to hear, the mute being able to speak. And this is, I mean, these kinds of miracles are just like, you don't realize, like, we just think, like, okay, if somebody's deaf and mute, it's like, Josh, you're mute right now. You're not talking. But if you just started talking, that wouldn't be anything miraculous. He went from not talking to talking. But this is a person who has never heard, who has never spoke, who has, so, and this is before, sign language. They didn't have sign language back then. This guy didn't know this guy had never communicated at all, probably, other than just, grunts and, whatever, rudimentary sign language, So, but when you see this miracle, he went from not only just not speaking to being able to speak and having all the mental faculties to be able to speak. I mean, do you realize how much his brain had to have just completely rewired and changed? It's like the person who's never walked, a lame person, and then all of a sudden they can walk. That's miraculous enough, but this is not a person who kind of knew how to walk, but it's they went from nothing, and then same thing with sight. Person has nothing in their brain, no neural pathways that process vision, and yet immediately they're, this is a miracle. This is a big one. But I don't know why he spits and all the, the other, the one where he spits and makes the mud and rubs it in the guy's eye. People always wonder, why did he do that? No idea. I guess just if I was to answer it as pragmatically as possible, I think it was just Jesus' way of saying, listen, this is not a magic, it's not a magic formula. If you just knew how Jesus did it, it'd be oh, this is how Jesus heals people, so you do these steps and do this thing and do. And he's it's not the same thing every single time. It's different, and why he chose this way, I don't know. Obviously the ears and the tongue thing or whatever, but and this is the other thing too is he's speaking in Aramaic, which is important for us to understand. And this is maybe just kind of a nerd thing that maybe doesn't seem to seem all that important, but to me, I think it helps illustrate how God inspired the scriptures to be written. Is they were written in Greek, which was not what Jesus was speaking. This is not what any of the disciples were speaking. They were speaking Aramaic. So when people say, oh, well, the Bible's been translated, so things get lost in translation, and so you can't really trust it, just know that the way God inspired Scripture to be written was a translation. It was a translation from Aramaic into Greek. And God didn't feel oh, man, I can't do this because things are going to get lost in translation. No, we know how to translate stuff. People can translate just fine, and also God's Spirit and God, protecting His Word, I think, is important too. But, so, and then in chapter 8, we'll get to it, and I want to kind of sandwich these two passages in between kind of what I was looking at this week, but he's going to go and he's going to feed the 4,000, which is, people wonder why 4,000 instead of 5,000. It's it doesn't matter. It's just equally as miraculous to feed 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread or whatever. It's people get hung up on these details, and it's just this is not what this is about. But these are Gentile people this time. So, before it was Jewish people, now he's doing it to Gentile people. And if you take what was the point of the feeding of the 5,000, it was much more than just food. It was, at the end of chapter 8, Jesus directly ties it into the teaching of the Pharisees, the leaven, the bread, so it's the teaching, it's the gospel, it's Jesus Christ himself. And what he's trying to communicate is, listen, I am sent to the lost sheep of Israel. So yeah, it makes sense. He's going to go and give of himself. He's going to offer the bread of life to the Jewish people. Well, what about the Gentile people? Yeah, he's going to go and offer the same thing to the Gentile people as well. So that in and of itself, I think, helps us to understand, I joked about that Jesse Peterson guy who said there's no such thing as racism. It's all just sin. Obviously, that's overly simplistic, and we wouldn't agree with that, but the answer is still the same. The way we need to be fighting this battle, to the extent that we see racism in our culture, we have to be dealing with this, but we have to understand that this is the answer is the bread of life. That's what we have to offer to people. It doesn't matter whether they're black people being discriminated against, white people, Asian people, what it does. The answer is Jesus Christ is what this person needs. So when we look at inequalities in our culture, so this is the other thing too, is why we have to understand the Bible's answer to racism is because if we look to the way that the world operates, we're going to be messed up from the get-go. The world doesn't know what it's talking about. It has no conception of how to deal with this hard issue. So it's just flailing about in confusion. And if we try to adopt that same policy, This is why when we look at, like, and we can, our heart can go out, and this is where I think people's heart is in the right place as far as they see things that seem unjust and unfair, and they want to deal with it, but they just think, well, it just must be racism. Well, is it racism? And so you look at things, and we want to deal. Like, it is a problem that we talked about last week. It's a problem that there are so many people in our country that are in prison. I mean, like, and you could say, well, there should be more people in prison, obviously, because there's still people out committing crimes. So why aren't they in prison? You can make that case, but the question then becomes, why do we have so many people in this country that are committing crimes? That, we're kind of in this transition in our country right now where marijuana is becoming legalized. And I was talking with someone the other day, and I said, whatever you think about marijuana being legalized, I mean, to be fair, I can see arguments either way, as far as our country. But leave all that stuff aside. It doesn't really matter. People get really frustrated that they say it's not right that, I don't want to name them because I'm recording, but people in this room's family who are like making money hand over fist now because they're dealing marijuana legally, and you've got somebody who's dealing, who's spending life in prison because they were selling marijuana and distributing it. Usually if you have a life sentence for marijuana, you were doing more than just selling it. There was violence and gang activity and probably massive distribution going on. But again, does it seem, there's massive distribution going on at the cannabis store, so it's like, so people say, well, if it's legal now, you should let all the people in prison out who did it. And like, that's the world's answer. But if you think about it, it's like, well, wait a second. You can make just as equal of a case that those people committed a crime. They did it when it was illegal. So the problem of just saying, well, that's not a crime anymore, so we should just let them out. Well, what happens when our country 20 years from now legalizes pedophilia? Are we going to say, like, I'm not saying that pedophilia and marijuana are on the same footing, but you know what I'm saying? Like, just as far as like, it's like, well, we should let all these people out now it says something about a person. Now, there are some laws that a person can make the case and say, listen, this is an unjust law. I'm not going to follow this law. Sorry, smoking pot's not one of them. That's not an unjust, that's a perfectly reasonable law. Whether you think about it or not, it's a perfectly reasonable law. It's not an unjust law. But it says something about a person's character and view of the law to say, I know this is illegal. I'm going to do it anyways. So to let that type of a person out of prison, well, that's their mentality is, I don't care what the law says. I'm going to do what I want. So all of the criminal justice stuff is saying we need to reform and let people out of prison and whatever. And this push now, and this is how the world deals with these issues. And we as the church can say, okay, this is an issue. Why is there this massive incarceration problem? The world, the way they deal with it is like, we've got a massive incarceration problem. Just let people out of prison. That's their solution. It's like in Venezuela. Do you know that in Venezuela, people don't die from hunger anymore? Do you want to know why? The government made it illegal to record hunger as cause of death in Venezuela. That's the same mentality. How do you solve a massive incarceration? You just let them out of prison. Well, then you've got a different problem. Then you've got somebody running their car into people at a Christmas parade in Waukesha. That's exactly what happened. Was this guy got let out of prison when he should have been in prison apparently, and he ran people down. So the world, the way that they view this is just wrong. The way we as Christians need to look at it is say, okay, it is wrong that we talked about this last week. Black males make up 7% of the population. And the criminals of black males is much smaller than that, obviously. But that's a small percentage of our population committing 50% of the violent crimes in this country. Why? So when people say, well, black men are more incarcerated than white people are. It's like, okay, that's a problem. But why is it a problem? Is it just, and the world just says, well, it's because they're black, that's why they're in prison, so we just, let them out of prison? I don't know what the solution is. If you think about it from the world's standpoint, the world is saying we have an over-incarceration problem, but at the same time, we should be letting people out of prison. And it's like, well, wait a second. Either these people are criminal. Either what you're saying is black people are being, you could say white people are being let off for crimes more than black people are. Is your argument then to arrest more white people? You think we have an over-incarceration rate. So that can't be the solution. So do we just let people who are legitimately criminals out of prison? Is that also, so it's, the world has the way of viewing things that it doesn't work. And that's why there's problems. When reality reasserts itself, a man runs his vehicle into a crowd of people because that's reality. And here's why this is a problem and why we have to view this the way that the Bible views this. I hadn't planned to go this way, but this is where we are in the text as far as dealing with this discrimination and this racism and stuff like that going on in the Jews and Gentiles. And of course, 2,000 years later, it's the same thing. It's just we see people as a group. That person's a black guy, so he must be a criminal. That person's a white person, so they must be an oppressor. That's not biblical thinking. To use, if that's your starting point in dealing with racism, you have already left biblical Christianity, if that's your way of dealing with things. But this organization, and I don't want to name them, and if you want to know who they are privately, I'll let them know, but they are a prominent global Christian organization, probably their own denomination, But they released this thing, and I just started seeing rumblings of it online, that this organization, I'm not going to give them another dime to them because of their racist stance that they're taking. And this organization doubled down on it. And they said, we defend this. We think it's right. And it was this 67-page pamphlet on how to lead discussions about racism within their organization. And I just want you to listen to this. Okay. This is how they come out of the gate defining racism. Now, if I was to ask everyone in this room, how would you define racism? You would say, treating somebody differently based on the color of their skin. Isn't that a pretty standard definition of racism? This definition of racism, right at the top of their definition, is the prejudiced treatment, stereotyping, or discrimination of people of color on the basis of race. Now, what does that mean by definition? White people cannot be the victims of racism. Only people of color can be victims of racism. Racism is the prejudiced treatment, stereotyping, or discrimination of people of color on the basis of race. So when people say, well, wait a second, affirmative action, which privileges minorities over white and Asian people, there's actually groups of Asian people who are suing schools like Harvard because they're being discriminated against, which they seem like they would be a people of color that are being discriminated against, but they're counted as white in some cases. I don't know, but that can't be discrimination or racism because whites are the ones who are being victimized by it. So it's not racism. So do you see already if a church and a Christian organization is trying to battle racism, which is a legitimate fight. Racism is a sin. People say it's like the original sin of America. Well, if that's the case, then, we've got racism, when we're going through the litany of sins in Revelation or in Romans 3, Mark threw in abortion. You can throw racism in there. It's there. It's a lot of the times it's ignorance. I was talking with a young lady when I was giving her Uber, and I referenced this already. She was talking about her family in rural Montana, and they're racist because they're blah blah blah. And I just try to tell her, they're probably not racist. They're just ignorant. They don't know. They just don't. They don't associate with people. It's like people in Bancroft. If people were to look at our church, they say that's a racist church. Why? Because there's no black people in the church. Well, there's no black people around here. It's like, so it's like, and so it's, would it be racist if a black person came and we're all like, that's, maybe, but it's just what it is. It's just something you don't see every day. It's just more like ignorance, but not ignorance in a bad way. It's just, this is not something I know I'm not versed in. So, and because of ignorance, people can fall into what you just see on TV. All I see on the news all day is just black people committing crimes, black people committing crimes, black people committing crimes. And if you don't know black people, and if you don't around it, if that's just all you think, then you could fall into having racist mentalities, and that's something that you got to deal with. But it's just like to just automatically assume you're white, so then you're racist. Wait a second, isn't that racism? No, not according to the world's definition. It's not. Well, and so that is then the ridiculousness of it. And this goes on. This goes on to say, it talks about whiteness. And just think about and they even say, me even talking about this as if this is offensive. That's a sign of whiteness and an ability and an unwillingness to deal with racism. Just by saying, hey, this is not right. That in and of itself just proves so it's kind of like a catch-22. If you say, yeah, I'm racist, then you're racist. If you say I'm not racist, then that proves that you're racist. It's like, well, wait a second, how do we deal with this? This is again, so outside of biblical Christianity, but that's the mentality of they go on to say whiteness is perpetuated in the Middle East and in North Africa and in European countries. And it's like, well, wait a second. What does that mean? If these people aren't white, what does whiteness mean? And it goes back to what our president said to a black person: if you don't know if you're going to vote for me, then you're not black. Wait, what does that mean? It's because you don't subscribe to this ideology that makes you know. And why a woman who's black, who's a conservative, or a man who's black can be labeled the black face of white supremacy. It's like, well, wait a second. How can it just doesn't make sense. But when a Christian organization has lost the plot this badly on how to deal with this issue, it's I don't even know what to do. And if you, like I said, I don't want to name the organization, but if you want to know what it is in case you want to stop supporting them, I'll be free to tell you off the record. But so then it goes on to talk about institutional racism. We talk about that, and systemic racism. These are discriminatory treatments, unfair policies, or biased practices based on race that result in inequitable outcomes for whites over people of color. And so that's a big buzzword that we hear, inequity, which is tricky because it sounds like inequality, but they're different. And inequity is something that results in different outcomes. So if we have a prison system and blacks make up an outsized population of the system, that's a racist system because there are more black people in prison than there are white people. So it's not equal. Schools, another instance. That's where the big thing is. People of color maybe don't get as good a grades as white people. Well, it must be racism. When you view the world through that lens, it just completely takes off the case of well, wait a second. Maybe there's something going on. You can't get to the root of the issue. What is going on that's causing these inequities or these inequalities? And if your answer is just, well, it's just racism, then we're gonna have a problem. So structural racism is the system of racial bias across institutions and societies. These systems give privileges to white people, resulting in disadvantages to people of color. Structural racism is defined as macro-level systems, social forces, institutions, ideologies, and processes that interact with one another to generate and reinforce inequities among racial and ethnic groups. Systemic racism describes a dynamic system that produces and replicates racial ideologies, identities, and inequities. So all of this is couched in this belief that only white people can be racist. So any policy that shows an outsized number of white people, that must be racist. Now just think about this for half of a second of how ridiculous this is. Think about if you were to look at the state of Michigan Congress. I just drove through the Capitol last night, and the Capitol is actually pretty breathtaking at night when you drive. It's a pretty awesome image. But if you were to look at, I don't know how many representatives there are, but let's say there's 100 because there's just a nice round number. If you were to look at the state representatives in Michigan and say, there's 95 white people in here and there's only 5 black people, this must be racism. Why is there so many? But then if you think about it, well, wait a second. One of those representatives is Ben Frederick, who represents an area where there are no black people. It's not racism, it's just there ain't no black people there. There are, but you know what I'm saying. Disproportionately, the odds of a black person becoming the representative of Shiawassee County is probably not very great. I don't know that there's necessarily any people in Shiawassee County that would I mean, there probably are people that would say, I don't want a black person representing me, but they're probably in the minority. I mean, let's be honest. But so if you look at then all of the districts around Michigan, how many of them are just like Shiawassee County? Well, all of the UP, for instance, I mean, when you start getting, there's only small districts that have minority groups. So out of the 100 groups, there's probably only going to be 10 or so districts that have an outsized minority group that would have minority representation. So like, but if you just look at the group and say, oh, there's just a lot of white people there, this must be racism. Not realizing that, well, wait a second, that is racism. To use these terms like whiteness, this is how white people think. It's no different than saying, this is how black people think. Like, it's just like, well, that might be how some black people think, but
Or maybe saying this is how women.
yeah, this is how women think. This is how, well, that might be how some women think, but it's not how all women think, so, and then, I won't go into this. They have this whole thing on, how to deal with this, this is things to help people identify your whiteness. Here, you want to know if you suffer from whiteness? Denial of racism. You're suffering from whiteness. It's like, are you defensive about race? Well, then you're suffering from whiteness, and you're just trying to perpetuate this white supremacy. So then that's why, again, why this bubbles up into the politics, but it's a much deeper issue, is that's why you can have a black person who's a conservative, and they say he's a white supremacist. Why? Because he supports an ideology that privileges white people, so he must be a white supremacist. Well, yeah, but he's black. Well, then he's just suffering from doublethink, and he doesn't know what it's like. And the church is trying to fight racism this way. Like, don't we realize? And the problem is where this is, people have labeled this neo-Marxism, which just means Marxism that's new. Neo means new, Marxism. And so when you read the Communist Manifesto, you open it up, the opening lines is, all of humanity is, up until this point, has been a history of class struggle. So Karl Marx thought employer-employee. That's how he viewed things. Rich, poor. Well, in America, we don't really have that problem. You can be poor and become rich very easily. But we do have this issue of, well, wait a second, there seems to be a lot of black people who are being discriminated against. Oh, we can use that as the struggle. White people are the ruling class. Minorities and people of color, they're the victims. So this is just the same ideology playing out in race. And that's why you wonder, why do people so badly want to be in a victim class in our culture? Well, it's because that makes you virtuous and that makes you a good guy under this realm of thinking. And this is why, again, biblical teaching on this is so antithetical to that. Like, that would be no different than saying the Syrophoenician woman is better than the Apostle Peter because she's a Syrophoenician woman. I mean, that is no different than what people believe in our culture right now. And that's the only reason I'm bringing this up is, again, I just want to keep reiterating, the church can't fight this battle this way. It is just wrong. Because then it leads, because you think, okay, well, they're just trying to be anti-racist and fight against racism by using racism, but they don't call it that, whatever. Because then it leads to stuff like this. A policymaker in New Zealand's Green Party said Jesus' mother, Mary, and her husband, Joseph, were Palestinian refugees. And you just think, well, that's not true. Almost none of that statement is true. They were Palestinian refugees. Why would someone want to label Jesus that way? Well, because Jesus is awfully convenient. If I can get Jesus on my side politically, well, then that's a good thing. I mean, disregard the fact that Jesus is totally against all of this. When you read Mark, he would be against, he would be flipping over tables at these anti-racist conferences and just saying this is not okay. But why frame it that way? Because if you tell the truth, remember how I said whiteness isn't just European, it's also Middle Eastern and Northern Africa? The reason they have to say that is because guess what? There are Jews in the Middle East. I don't know if you know that. And Jews are oppressors. They are part of the white group that are oppressors. Well, Jesus can't be an oppressor. He can't be a Jew. So we've got to label him a Palestinian because that's a victim class in this way of thinking. So we're going to just lie about Jesus' race because then that puts him on the good guys team. I mean, do you see how distorted this thinking is?
It's distorted to think of Jesus as a victim.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, he was victimized in so much as he became a human. He became a part of our group, but I just can't imagine how offended Jesus. I mean, I think people would think, oh, well, Jesus would be virtuous, and he would view it as a privilege to be viewed with any underclass or whatever. And he'd be like, no, I'm a Jew. I'm proud to be a Jew. I think that would be Jesus' mentality. But because this is such a, dare I say, demonic way of thinking, it just has to take the truth and twist it. And that's why I'm I would just encourage you, when we're looking at the scripture and what Jesus is doing, he's saying it doesn't matter whether you are a woman or a man, a Syrophoenician or a Jew. I mean, none of that stuff matters. What matters is you need Christ, and here I am offering myself to him, and that will solve your problems. Is there an over-incarceration rate of a certain group? Well, maybe there's an under-representation of Jesus in that group. I don't know. But to just categorically label it as racism, I mean, it's just such a wrong way of thinking. But we are out of time, and we will pick up next week. We got all that out of the way, so we're not going to be talking about. We'll just continue on with Mark chapter 8 and the feeding of the 4,000. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission. If you like what you heard on this episode, why don't you become a monthly supporter of the ministry? It really helps me out. $10 a month or whatever the Lord lays on your heart. So if you're interested in becoming a partner, you can text the word discipleship to 41444 or head over to infaith.org/Dennis-Southerby. And if you have any questions or topics that you would like me to address on a future episode of Faith in Focus, why don't you shoot me an email? You can email me at dennissoutherby@infaith.org. Just put in the subject line, question for Faith in Focus or something like that. So I can see it, know that it's from you, and know that it's an issue that you would like me to address.